Hey everyone, as every film nerd does around this time of year, or at the beginning of the following year, everyone does a best of list. Some people do a worst of list too. And I'm uploading this after I'm on a live stream with Master Chaos on Friday, where I'm going over my bottom 5 worst films that I saw of 2022, as well as my top 5. But I'm recording this earlier. This is going to be my top 10 list, so my 10 best or 10 favorite, whatever you want to say, films of 2022. Also, I thought I'd change things up a little bit, so I'm sitting on my bar stool in my living room with my nerdy mantle behind me. So, just thought I'd change it up. So 2022. 2022 was a, let's say, mixed year for me in my life in general. There was some positive stuff that happened in my professional life, but terrible stuff that happened in my personal life. So I've had some bad years in my life, but not the worst. So But as a contrast to that, 2022 actually happened to be a pretty damn great year for movies. There's a lot of years, top 10 is usually the number people go with these lists, they're top 10. Sometimes they're ranked, sometimes they're not, whatever. But some years I struggle to find 10 movies that I think should be called best or top or favorite or what have you. And so I've done some years only at 7 or 9 or weird like that. This year was actually, there were a lot of movies that didn't make this list that I really liked. In fact, a lot of Oscar contenders, serious Oscar contenders that I really liked, I didn't quite love, and so that kept them from getting on this list. I will say, having Letterboxd, in 2022 is the first full year I've had Letterboxd. I started it halfway through 2021. That has been great as far as compiling this list, because there were movies that I forgot I saw because they were so long ago, or, it's I rated this 3.5 stars, which is a B for me, but this was, or a B plus rather, but I rated this 4, which is more like an A minus or an A, so yeah, I definitely like this more than this, and that sort of thing. So it really helped me with compiling this list, and I encourage anyone who's into film to do a Letterboxd, even if you don't want to write reviews like I do, just be able to track what you've seen. I think it's fun, but whatever. So, a couple things to preface here. Of my top 10, a lot of them, way more than usual, are horror films. I mean, I love horror. Horror has a special place in my heart. But I looked at my 2021 list, and there's only one horror movie that was on there, and it was Titane. And even then, it's more horror adjacent, really. I guess if you count Ghostbusters Afterlife as also being horror adjacent, then 2, but that's fine. But a full, I think, 7 of my top 10 list are horror this year. And because a lot of those Oscar contenders and stuff that I liked, it's because I liked them but didn't love them. But there was enough horror movies that came out this year that I really passionately loved, and so my list isn't going to be as affluent, hoity-toity, pretentious, criticky as it normally is this year. This year is going to have a lot of horror stuff on it. Some of them are deeper cuts than whatever, because there are other movies that came out, like Smile was really popular. I fucking hated it, so that's not, it didn't make my bottom either, at least not my bottom 5. I didn't make a 10 list there, but there was a lot of other stuff that came out that I really liked. Of my top 10, only 2 or 3 of them, the non-horror ones, are in contention for any Oscars right now as far as awards chatter and things like that. So buckle up, and let's go into my top 10, starting with number 10. Number 10 stars this little guy. It's Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. Yes, I love the movie so much that I bought an overpriced, tiny little die-cast version of Marcel, and I guess I might as well just keep him in my hand while I'm talking about the movie. Ah, no, I fell down. So Marcel the Shell with Shoes On is an animated film. There's some live-action elements included in there, but enough of it is animated or stop-motion to be in consideration for the Best Animated Feature Oscar, where it has some competition, but we'll see how it does. Marcel is the cute little story about a little anthropomorphic shell and his grandmother, who are in a house that is being rented to a documentary filmmaker as sort of an extended stay Airbnb thing. But most of their family, the shell's family, was taken by one of the former residents of the house when he moved out in a huff, and he just kind of threw his belongings in a drawer and carried him off. And so the movie is about Marcel using his new documentary filmmaker friend, who shoots the movie, to try and find where his family went. And it's aside from being very funny and clever, it is very heartwarming and endearing in a way that few movies really are. And I don't have kids. Most of my friends, I don't hang out with them and their kids or whatever. So I don't watch a lot of family movies or like animated movies anymore that are aimed toward like a children or family audience. But this one, because it was an A24 movie, I decided to give it a shot, even though I hadn't watched any of the Marcel shorts prior. Plus, I like Jenny Slate, who does the voice of little Marcel here. So I went to go see it. And there's, Marcel, Isabella Rossellini does the voice of the grandmother, and I was just taken aback by how good it made me feel. Like, I usually enjoy movies that are a bit more nihilistic and depressing, which probably says something about my general state of being or whatnot. But this one just left me with a very warm, happy feeling, and even though the movie does get very sad at some times as well, so it just pulled the heartstrings enough, and that I found it weirdly emotionally powerful, which I was not expecting an animated movie about a talking shell with a little cute little voice and everything to make me feel. So it ended up getting just up there into my list. So number 10 was Little Marcel. 9 is James Cameron's belated sequel, Avatar: The Way of Water. So I recently rewatched the original Avatar because I hadn't seen it since it was originally in theaters in 2009, and like many people, I had the basic feeling of that it was like very visually striking and the technology was great, but that the story and the characters were a bit lacking. I was never like a full-on like Avatar hater or anyone, but it was sort of odd that first Avatar didn't have as much of a social connective tissue as a lot of other big movies, especially for a movie that is the highest grossing film worldwide, and I think second highest grossing domestic, maybe, if that may have changed. There's not a lot of people who like are really into the lore of Avatar or write fan fiction or cosplay at conventions. There's not a lot of merch outside of the Disney park, which I went to in September. And it is very cool. There's two rides. The 3D one where you're riding the Banshee is really cool. The water ride kind of sucks, but it's chill. So it was very weird that it didn't have as much like enthusiastic fandom as other things. But James Cameron, being as he is, he still has worked on this and however many sequels he ends up making. So I watched that original again on Disney Plus just to refresh. And then I go into the sequel, and I go see it in IMAX 3D, and it is just the best CGI movie in a long-ass time. As someone who is just sick and tired of seeing bad CGI, especially really bad chroma keyed green screens in MCU movies, or just tired of movies that are just boiled down to digital shit punching other digital shit, Avatar was a movie that truly engaged a sense of wonder. Like, you're looking at some of the 3D visuals and the CGI visuals, and you're like, this looks pretty photoreal, probably about as good as CGI as might get in my lifetime. I mean, who knows? And I can't remember the last time I saw a movie that was just so CGI heavy that I was actually like amazed or in awe of the visuals. Most of the times you see like Avengers Endgame or Infinity War or whatever, and regardless of the individual quality of those movies, the CGI is just sort of like, whatever, I guess Rocket looks okay, but that green screen is really wonky, and this is color timed poorly, and everything looks flat, that kind of thing. It's just been so long since I've seen a movie that made me go wow with the effects that was there. And then this one has, I want to say, a better and more engaging story than the original. The characters are not terrible, it's just that there's no one you're like super invested in. I mean, I do like that Jake Sully becomes sort of like a Che Guevara figure, like hitting supply trains for the military and the imperialist stuff. And like the general like pro-environment, anti-military, anti-capitalist message of the movie obviously appeals to my Marxist heart. But it's just truly a movie that deserves to be on my list because it's just a breathtaking technological, like, visual wonder. And, you know, to go to a movie and expect to see, like, these great, like, how did they do that visuals? I mean, I can go back and watch, like, some cool 80s horror movies that have real goopy practical effects or whatever. Just the previous night, I watched the 1978 Invasion of the Body Snatchers remake, which I hadn't seen in a while, and, like, those practical effects are still, like, wow. But most CGI just doesn't impress me. It's like that That Don't Impress Me Much song. No, that's Shania Twain. But this one actually impressed me, and there's just... You know, you have a first act that has, like, a lot of action-heavy stuff. It has some humor in it. The second act is more like, here's the ocean, and here's our space whale, and look how beautiful this is. And then the third act is, like, plenty of action again. And I was just, like, for a movie that's a little over 3 hours, it's probably, if you don't watch the credits, it's probably only about 3 hours anyway, but I was, like, fully invested in that entire time span. Like, I was never, like, bored. I wasn't, like, in a rush to go pee or anything. And I just really was enveloped in the story, and while the characters might not be, like, you know, I'm super invested in this character, it was at least still very good. I still, like, you know, Jake Sully, Neytiri, I think Neytiri kind of gets, like, the short end of the stick. It focuses mostly on the kids, mainly the second oldest boy, son of the Sullys. And yeah, people have said, like, oh, they say bro too much or whatever. Fine. I mean, James Cameron's, what, 60-something? He's writing teenagers. Just give him a pass. So, but I highly, highly enjoyed it. Like, it was actually, like, CGI-heavy action scenes that actually were, like, exciting. I mean, usually the closest I come to that is, like, John Wick, which has CGI blood splatters, which I still prefer squibs. But generally, I'm just bored by CGI action scenes these days. I'm like, you know, whatever. This one was actually, like, exciting when they're going after the boat and all that stuff. This is maybe one of the few films that would make a list solely based on it has just gorgeous visuals. And so because it had that sort of childlike awe that I very rarely see at big blockbuster movies anymore, that's why it's on the list at number 9. Number 8 is Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, which came out way early in the spring and was the A24 independent movie multiverse film to contrast to Spider-Man No Way Home. When I watched Everything, Everywhere, and I'm just going to shorten it as that, what I was most taken aback is I was watching this movie and I'm like, I can't imagine how fucking difficult this was to shoot and to edit because of all the different cuts to different versions of Michelle Yeoh, and it goes from dimension to dimension, and there's a lot of, like, action-y whipcam and everything, and all I could think of is, like, wow, just from being the two directors, the two Daniels, on set, that must have been an incredibly difficult movie to make. So I just had a lot of kudos just on, like, the technical aspects of getting this all together and making it cut properly in the editing room after. Like, multiverses or parallel universes, it's not a particularly new subject matter or storyline. I remember when I was a kid and I liked that shitty Sliders TV show that was on Fox with Jerry O'Connell. What Everything Everywhere did well was the mixing of genres. It goes for emotion, it goes for high art, like slapstick comedy, as well as some sly comedy, as well as scatological humor with the fucking butt plug award. It involves, yeah, you got the action, you got the comedy, you got the drama, you got the science fiction element. A lot of disparate elements that really could have fallen apart. This could easily have been a movie that was just a chaotic and hyperkinetic tonal mess, and they pulled it off. And they pulled it off with being able to anchor everything with a certain amount of sincerity. You start off with the family, you know, they've got troubles with money and the IRS, and, you know, this slightly loveless almost marriage, and yet there's still love there, and the family dynamic and the stress there. And it doesn't, until they finally get into the office and the second Quan comes in, that's when things are just off to the races and they do not stop. And aside from being one of the funniest films of the year, I was just mostly impressed with how all of these disparate elements came together, because at any given moment, this movie could have fallen apart under the weight of its own ambition. This was so, like, I can't even imagine, like, the stage directions they had to put in the screenplay, and just trying to keep everything together in a way that would make sense, especially when your characters are jumping from dimension to dimension in their own heads, and you're cutting back and forth between these different settings and times and keeping that all together. The movie really only slows down with the two googly-eyed rocks talking to each other scene. So I was just very shocked that it all worked properly. And not only that, but it worked better than I would have expected. And if you like, I'm not a huge martial arts Hong Kong, action-y movie type person, but I do like a good martial arts fight in a movie like this, and especially Quan, I think that's his last name, right? Where he's using the fucking messenger bag or the fanny pack and he's whipping the people around. It was just a very fun movie, but it wasn't just silly comedy for the sake of silly comedy either. It did have that sort of sometimes Adult Swim type humor with it. But it was tied together so well with that heart and that sort of mother-daughter dynamic in there, as well as the married couple dynamic, too. And it just did a lot of things right that was just, it was like balancing on a high wire. And so it's not higher up on the list because I didn't love it as much as some of the other stuff on this, but it has... it's mostly on this list because of how much I admired and respected it, because I all I could think about was how many ways this movie could have been absolute garbage, and they avoided all of that to make one of the best films of the year, and one that sort of captured the cultural zeitgeist as far as in right now, the indie film world isn't doing well. I think because people are I'll just wait for that to be on PVOD now, or it's going to be on streaming super quick now in this post-COVID era. But this was the indie movie that, it opened in limited release, it had a platform release, it opened big, and then it opened wide and slowly widened up, and then it ended up being the highest grossing film A24 has distributed and has sort of captured the zeitgeist as far as the indie movie that mainstream audiences came to, and it sort of helped that it was able to piggyback a couple months after No Way Home, so people already had multiverse in their head. But yeah, so that's number 8, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Number 7 is Barbarian. Barbarian was a movie that I have to give a lot of credit to the marketing team at Fox, because it would have been so easy to ruin this movie by giving too much away in the marketing, and all the marketing did was basically just tell you what the premise was, and that's it. And Barbarian is one of the few... It does something that I love with movies that I almost never see, because... if you see enough movies, chances are if you go to see a movie, from the moment you sit down, you pretty much know how that movie is going to unfold. You don't know every single step, or maybe there's a couple twists involved, but pretty much anytime you sit down for a movie, you basically know what's going to happen as far as this will be the first act, the second act, the third act, this is probably where we're going to end up. Maybe the ending will be more negative or more positive than you thought, whatever, but generally you know how a movie's going to unfold when you see it. Barbarian is probably the first movie since maybe the original Martyrs, one of my favorite horror films, where I didn't know where the movie was going for most of its runtime. Really not until the third act when everything finally coalesces, and even then I didn't see some other stuff coming there. Because you have basically, if you haven't seen it, spoilers, you can skip this section. But you have the premise, which is that basically an Airbnb got double booked in a shitty part of Detroit. And you're not sure if the guy who's already in the house has something nefarious going on, and then they cast Skarsgård, who's known for playing creeps like Pennywise, and so there's a nice little casting misdirection there. And then you find out something weird's happened in the basement, and then there's a hard cut, and then you're completely taken somewhere else in the second act, where you got Justin Long, and he's a sleazy TV producer who's being Me Too'd, and so he goes back, and he's the owner of the house. And then at the end of that, there's a hard cut, and then suddenly you're in the 1980s, and Richard Brake is there. And the movie slowly unfolds itself to being, following in Jordan Peele's footsteps, a horror movie that was made by a guy previously known for comedy, because the director of this one, Zach Cregg, I think is his name, Craig or Kreger. He originally directed or co-directed that shitty Miss March movie, though I do like... what's his name? Craig Robinson's 2 terrible songs in that movie. Those are really funny, but otherwise, no. And The Wise Kid You Know, which I never watched it. and he made this movie that talks about things like gentrification and, you know, the Reaganite stuff destroying the suburbs and, you know, ACAB. There's a lot of stuff in that movie that has that social commentary. But also, if you want to completely avoid the social commentary because you're a right-wing piece of shit, you can still just sort of enjoy it as this interesting little, like, horror mystery movie. But it doesn't have as many artsy pretensions as Jordan Peele's like Get Out and Us and Nope. It's a little bit closer to not as like crazy as like Malignant, but it's a little bit more on that sort of like basket case batshit type version of horror versus the more elevated stuff. But it still had a lot of that commentary in there, which I very much appreciated. Plus just the general surprise. If you can make a movie and you structure it with your screenplay in a way where I don't know where it's going, congrats, because that very rarely happens anymore, considering I see, well, I mean, in 2022, by the end of this year, I will have seen somewhere around 420 movies. Smoke them if you got them. I saw a lot of movies this year. Some of them were limited series, and some of them were short films, because Letterboxd lets you log those as movies as well. But I saw a lot of movies this year, and so when you see 400 movies a year like I do, things don't surprise you as often as they would for just the casual moviegoer. And the fact that Barbarian surprised me, and on top of the surprises, was also a really damn good movie, I had to make it on this list. So, Barbarian. 6 is Scream 5, or just Scream, or Scream 2022, or whatever you want to call it, which opened way back in January, so it feels like last year. So I'm a Scream fanboy. I was 13 years old when I saw the original Scream in theaters. I was 14 when I saw the Scream 2 in theaters. Scream 3 is shit and it's not canon. Scream 3 is not canon. And Scream 4 I really like. I even rewatched Scream 4, I think before I went to go see Scream 5. And with the exception of everything that happens in that hospital that was forced out of Kevin Williamson and was written by Aaron Kruger and forced in there by Bob and Harvey Weinstein, I like Scream 4, but it is tainted by that terrible ending. It's also tainted by the fact that that movie didn't have the balls to kill off any of the returning characters. So they had plot armor, and it was safe, and so you have less stakes. So Scream 5, I would rank just below Scream 2. So for me, it goes 1, 2, 5, 4, and then way down the abomination that is the non-canon Scream 3. But going into Scream 5, it was the first one that was not directed by Wes Craven. It's the first one not written by Kevin Williamson, because 3's not canon. I'm going to keep beating that dead horse. But it was by the Radio Silence guys who made Ready or Not, which was a very good horror comedy. They've also worked on some other stuff, I think Southbound, which was okay, and some of the stuff from the VHS movies, I think. So I was worried about that. Plus, you're bringing in new characters, so the legacy characters don't have as much to do. I will say, I have some minor issues with the movie. I think Sidney Prescott's character is written a little too, whatever. She's a little too comfortable with this by now. I know she's been through it like 4 times, but it still seemed a little... It felt more like Neve Campbell than it did Sidney Prescott. And I met Neve Campbell at a convention in February, just a couple weeks after seeing the movie. And yeah, it felt more like Neve Campbell there. But David Arquette as Dewey, it's one of his best performances as that character, and a real show. So a lot of people have issues with Scream 5 that I don't agree with. I think the toxic fandom motive was really good and really timely, especially in this internet age of Snyder bros and all that stuff, and people who just harp on The Last Jedi. It's like, if you didn't like it, fine, but get over it now. Like, there's going to be a lot more Star Wars shit for the rest of our lives, and even after everyone who's watching this is dead. So lay off him. He's got his new Knives Out franchise. He's cool. So I thought that was pretty timely. I like that it discussed a lot of the trends, because Scream 4 came out in the early, or the late 2000s, early 2010s horror hard remake boot. And this one came out after the Legacy sequels, which the movie calls requels. You can call them belated sequels, what have you. There's plenty of different terms for them. As well as the elevated horror that's going on right now with the A24 stuff. So it touches on those a little bit as well, so I enjoyed that. I like the addition of the new characters. I like the two Carpenter girls. I liked Jack Quaid, who won't be back for the next one for obvious reasons. I like the kid from 13 Reasons Why, who plays the West there. I like that it did kill some survivors. It killed 2 survivors, technically. So I like that it didn't give them artificial plot armor because it was afraid of pissing off like idiot fanboys who think you can't kill anyone in a fucking slasher movie. And I really like that they still honored the basic style of Wes Craven's directing, which has never been terribly showy, while still staying true to what Scream is. And I like that it was sort of moving it away from the story of Sidney Prescott onto some of these new characters, and that it still sort of was there. And with the exception of Randy's sister still being played by Heather Matazzaro, which I've never had any problem with that casting, nothing they said in the movie forces me to consider Scream 3 canon, because they say it all begins with Billy Loomis, but technically if Scream 3 is canon, it all began with Robin Bridger. Nope. Scream 3 is not canon still. But it was basically everything I wanted a new Scream to be, especially in the hands of people who had not made a previous Scream movie. So I highly, highly enjoyed it, and the people who don't like it, I don't know what the fuck you're smoking. You want a different Scream movie than I do. And I'm very much looking forward to 6, which portends to be even more different and new and interesting. And, after we've had 3 solid Scream movies of the regular stuff, with 1, 2, and 4, most of 4, 90% of 4. I'm looking to see what new can be done while still sticking within the fundamentals of, it's a human as Ghostface, nothing supernatural, it's a whodunit, that kind of thing. So, Scream 5, loved it. Number 5 is Terrifier 2. So, not the classiest pick. It's a splatter movie. It's an old-fashioned splatter movie, and because NC-17 horror movies don't get into wide release in theaters like this did, I'm fairly certain that even though this isn't the goriest movie I've ever seen, it definitely is the goriest movie I've ever seen in a movie theater. So, I like the first Terrifier quite a bit. A friend of mine had seen it before anybody had heard of it, before it got on Netflix, and that's kind of where it exploded. They recommended it. I blind bought the Blu-ray. I really enjoyed it. I recorded a video on YouTube. I think the video I recorded on YouTube is not as positive as I ended up feeling about that movie over time. And since then, I've met the director, I've met David Thornton, who plays art at conventions, and all that good stuff. And so I've been waiting for Terrifier 2, as most of us have for a while, because if it weren't for COVID, it probably would have come out much earlier. But it finally did, and they put it into theaters, and it is a 2.5-hour, super gory, old-fashioned slasher movie with splatter movie effects, and damn if I wasn't missing movies like that, because I love a lot of different types of horror. I'd say jump scare horror, like Smile, and J-horror are the 2 horror subgenres I really do not like at all. But otherwise, most horror is cool with me. I just love horror. But we don't get a lot of old-school slasher movies, and we certainly don't get them as gory as they used to be in the 80s. Not since the torture horror, which a lot of people don't like, but I still do, from the late 2000s, or early to late 2000s. I also like that one of the criticisms a lot of people had with the original Terrifier is that they liked the gore, but the characters were pretty weak. And in this one, we get a better lead character with Sierra, and we also get our younger brother, and we get some other characters that we care about a little bit more in order to follow, and that helps sort of ground the whole thing. Plus, you get more stuff added to like the mythology of Art the Clown, and it's just like this giant, bloody, bombastic horror sequel. And Art the Clown is probably the closest thing to a new horror icon we have now. I'd say like the last horror icon we have, arguably, is Billy the Clown Puppet or Jigsaw from the Saw movies. I guess if you like the Conjuring movies, maybe Annabelle or The Nun or whatever, but I fucking hate those movies, and I hate that they, make heroes out of those horrible con men, the Warrens. So I've only ever seen the first Nun. I was kind of dragged to it by my ex-fiancée at this time, and her mother fell asleep during it, and it sucked balls. I think it was my worst film of that year. But aside, if you ignore the shitty piece of shit Conjuring movies, yeah, Art the Clown probably since, Saw from 2004, as far as like the franchises go. So if you don't like super gory splatter movies that are very long, you're not gonna like it. But as someone who, when he was 18 years old, started to write a screenplay that I've still played around with for fucking 21 years now. I'll probably never end up making the movie. But it was like, I really want to make a 3-hour long NC-17 rated horror movie. And Damien Leone made a 2.5-hour unrated, but would be NC-17 if they gave it to the board, bloody horror movie. And you know what? Good for him. Good, and he did most of the effects himself. He did it on by most accounts, shoestring budget, maybe like $200,000 tops. And the thing makes $10 million in theaters before going to a streaming service, so a Screambox. It was one of the few movies since COVID that has actually like gone on to have legs, where it opens in limited release, they extend the run, it keeps adding theaters, and then it keeps making more money every week instead of declining. I mean, if they didn't want to drop it on a streaming service in time for Halloween, they probably could have pushed it into November and it would have made even more money. But it sort of became this sort of thing, because even with the original Terrifier getting this big fan base once the movie launched on Netflix and people were able to check it out, it seems like word of mouth got people who had not even seen that movie to go see Terrifier 2. And All Hallows Eve, the anthology movie that Art was played by a different actor in, but sort of began the whole thing outside of that original short film that Damien Leone made, Ninth Circle or whatever it's called. So I really enjoyed it, and so while it might not be the classiest movie, it's not going to get nominated for any Oscars or whatever, I highly, highly enjoyed it, so Terrifier 2 is my number 5. My number 4 follows a very similar path as my number 5. My number 4 is a movie from Taiwan that dropped on Shudder this year, so I was able to watch it, called The Sadness. The Sadness is not a zombie movie per se, but it does follow the general conventions of a zombie movie, but it's probably closer to something like The Crazies or 28 Days Later or something like that, where it's just sort of infected human beings. But the premise is that there's some sort of disease that turns people's eyes black, and it completely eliminates like the moral compass in their brain, and so they just kind of hedonistically murder and rage and assault and all the bad stuff. And maybe it's because it's from Taiwan, but it's probably the closest movie I've seen to like a Hong Kong Category 3 horror movie since the end of that era when China took over Hong Kong from the British in the 90s. It is just a gory, bleak, dark, hopeless, nihilistic horror movie. And I fucking love that. It's not everyone's cup of tea. For some people, it will be too bloody or too without hope or too nihilistic or too downbeat. But that sort of just hits all of my buttons as far as what I want from something like that. It is... I don't get disturbed by much, so maybe I shouldn't say it's disturbing to me, because it's not. But it's a movie that would disturb most other people if I were to show them this movie. And a lot of it is that a romantically involved couple gets separated, and so it follows them on two parallel tracks as they're trying to not die and to find each other again. And because the people who are infected aren't like zombies or whatever, they can talk, they can taunt, they can say really disturbing, crude things, and they're into like self-mutilation, mutilating others, they can latch onto people with vendettas. And at the same time, you're also seeing that the people who are not infected are also starting to come apart at the seams in the middle of the situation, as you'd see in like zombie movies and stuff like that. So, the zombie subgenre kind of played itself out when it got oversaturated. So if anybody can add something a little bit new to it, it helps. Like One Cut of the Dead did a couple years ago, stuff like that. So while The Sadness isn't strictly a zombie movie, it does follow all of the general conventions of a horror movie, or of a zombie movie rather, that you can kind of put it into that subgenre, even though it's like a well actually type when you're talking about that, much as like 28 Days Later is, and The Crazies and that sort of thing. So It's not going to be for everybody. I mean, no movie on this list is going to be for everybody, really. Maybe Marcel. But I would definitely say that if you like the sort of like bleak, nihilistic, gory, disturbing horror movie that is just sort of like, there is no hope in my soul and I need to go get an ice cream sandwich now to feel better, I would recommend The Sadness. So, number 4. Number 3 is a movie that premiered at Sundance, and Shudder bought the rights to it and then dropped it on their service. And it's called Resurrection. Resurrection stars Rebecca Hall as a single mother who one day, a mentally and emotionally abusive ex-lover shows up in town. And he doesn't approach her or anything, but he's there on the sidelines. And Rebecca Hall's character starts to unravel as she knows that he's doing this to fuck with her, and it kind of spirals from there. And the reason it's so high on this list is, well, for one, Rebecca Hall gives a stellar performance. Like, a lot of people were talking about how Mia Goth did a great job in Pearl in this one scene where the camera is just static on her and she's pouring her heart out in this monologue. And it is a great scene. But Rebecca Hall has a very similar scene in this movie that's even better, where she is recounting the history of herself with this man and the relationship she had with him and what he put her through. And there's lots of movies about partners who are physically abusive, sexually abusive, emotionally abusive, mentally abusive. But this movie took it in a different way. Like, Tim Roth is the ex-boyfriend here, so he's the abusive guy in this movie. And his character is abusive in a very cruel, realistic way, where he's not foaming at the mouth like Sleeping with the Enemy or something, and he's not just a normal like gaslighter kind of person, or like insulting and degrading. He has a very specific way of emotionally abusing our character that not from personal experience, thankfully. I've had emotionally abusive partners before, but not anywhere close to Tim Roth in this movie. But it's very realistic, and in a way I don't think I've ever seen depicted accurately in a movie before. And I can't even quite describe it, especially because it would be a spoiler too. But he does something so cruel to her to keep her under his power. And it is, because it is so illogical what he's telling her, the fact that she is so tied to him because of this is all the more sad, until the movie follows through with a very messed up and disturbing conclusion to how this is going to happen, where people start to think that Rebecca Hall's character is crazy and that this guy's not really doing any of this, or he's not really around, but she's also keeping things secret to protect her daughter and stuff like that. And so it goes into some very dark places, but for a while it's not dark in like a movie way. It's dark in a way that I could see really, really evil people being. Like, it's a more it's not exaggerated in a fake way, but it's a more exaggerated version of like the terrible characters in Neil LaBute's early movies, In the Company of Men and Your Friends and Neighbors, if you're familiar with those movies, where it's just like, what is the worst thing you can do to another human being mentally and emotionally while kind of not breaking any laws doing it? I mean, there's a big asterisk there that I'm not going to go into because of spoilers, but he's cruel in a way where he can get away with it, and it's very realistic in that fashion, and it's very hard for me to say why I love this movie so much without going into spoilers, and so I'm keeping it very vague. But outside of the stuff that happens within the story, it's anchored by incredible performances. Tim Roth as the abusive, he finds a way of coming across as nice, surface-wise, and yet very threatening at the same time. Like, you're never afraid he's gonna, like, be physically violent or lash out or like hit her or anything. But there's something so cruel and evil about him behind just like a normal visage that it hits a certain type of evil. Because most terrible human beings, they don't come across as just like someone you'd see like with their mugshot America's Most Wanted. Some of the worst human beings, they just look like normal people who might smile at you when they're checking out at the grocery store, and he captures that. And you don't see that a lot in movies because films think they need to be heightened dramatically for you to understand certain things. And I'm not calling the movie like subtle. It's not like you have to read much into it. It's all going to be there for the average viewer to see. But it threads the needle so well that I was just sort of astounded by how excellently executed this movie was. So it's also not, even though it's on Shudder and everything, and even though the ending gets pretty bloody and stuff, it's not what you would traditionally call a horror movie. It probably fits into that elevated genre as well. And it's not, it doesn't hammer you over the head with like sort of like Me Too stuff or anything either if you're not inclined for something like that. But it very much is about how women can be emotionally abused and trapped, even if they're not physically confined, but trapped by their relationship with a very terrible, amoral man. And how they can try to get away from that and what that grasp is and how that can damage somebody. And when you get toward the end of the film where the man has damaged the woman to such a degree that even he can't control her anymore because he's made her lose her sanity too much, like he's just pushed her too far where he can't control her anymore, that gets to a very scary place in the movie. So I guess it's one of the least viewed movies of this list as far as like people I know who have seen it, which is almost none. So I'd highly recommend checking that out. It's on Shudder, but you might be able to find it for rent if you don't want to subscribe to Shudder or whatever. Resurrection 2022. Number 2 is a movie called Watcher. Not The Watcher, the shitty Netflix miniseries that I had to shut off because the dialogue was too terrible, but just called Watcher. And it stars Maika Monroe, the lead actress from It Follows. And she and her husband moved to her husband's home country of, I think, Bulgaria, Romania. It's been a while since I've seen the movie. And they're in a nice apartment, but, it's a foreign country to her. She doesn't know the language. And so she's already sort of, like, isolated there. It's a country that people in the West, stereotypically or not, maybe view as a bit more unsafe than some other countries like France or England or whatever. And one day she looks across out her giant window and she sees a shadowy figure in the window, and they may or may not just be watching her. And then, she goes to to the movies and grocery shopping, and she thinks someone's following her. And then one day she's looking out the window and she sort of waves, and the figure slowly waves back at her. And so a lot of the movie is sort of about, is this woman paranoid or is she being watched? And if she is being actively watched by this person, do they have nefarious intentions? Or is she just projecting that because she is a woman in a foreign country who doesn't know the language and is already isolated? So a lot of people will throw around superlatives about movies. They'll say it's edge of your seat, or they'll say it's suspenseful, or Hitchcockian, or things like that. But a lot of the times they'll say that about a movie, and that movie, it might have suspense, but I'm not literally on the edge of my seat. I'm not actually feeling anxiety or tension while watching it. I'm just maybe enjoying it. Watcher is the first movie in a very long time where I was literally on the edge of my seat. I saw this in the theater before it went to Shudder. I think it was also at some film festivals as well. And there were only 2 people in the theater. I was sitting pretty close to the front as I normally do, and there was one other person sitting way in the back alone. And a lot of this movie, I was actually suspenseful and anxious and nervous, and and like I was like, you know, people say edge of your seat or suspenseful, but this was the most suspenseful edge of your seat movie I have seen in quite a long time. And you know, knowing movie conventions, you assume something nefarious is going on because one or two things is either happening: either she's crazy and paranoid, or she is right to be concerned and no one believes her, and it's a little bit of the whole believe women thing that's going on. But the movie is executed so well, and Maika Monroe, I don't know why she hasn't become bigger as an actress. Like, she was excellent in It Follows, a movie I fucking love. The last movie I've actually seen, well, one of the few movies I've actually gone to see in a theater more than once, because I usually don't repeat view movies in theaters. But she is excellent in that movie, and she's been wasted in some movies like Independence Day, Resurgence, and whatever. But she is enormously talented, and she gives a phenomenal performance in this movie. Like, she's in every scene of the film. She's almost in every frame of the movie. And she is so captivating in this. Like, you can read the expressions on her face, even when she's not saying anything. If she's in a scene with a bunch of other people, and they're speaking the other language, they don't give the audience subtitles, so you don't know what they're saying, so you're in her shoes, and you get her confusion, her frustration, and all that stuff. And you basically go on the journey with her, and because she is such a talented actress, she is able to convey what she needs to without just coming out and just flat out saying it, except for when it's actually necessary. And because she's also great, and because you feel a connection to this character, when she's in danger, you feel like you're in danger too. If she's walking down a street and someone may be following her, or she's in a grocery store and someone may be like looking into the rows for her and everything. So yeah, I think some people might complain that not necessarily the very ending of the movie, because I think the very ending of the movie is absolutely perfect, but the revelation of what's going on and how much of a threat it is, some people might think it's not as twisty as it could be. I don't know, but I actually did not know if they were going to go in the direction they go to, or if it was going to be another misdirection. And I think the fact that they leave that option open until the ultimate revelation, because eventually you do find out who at least the person in the window is and what they're going on about. I think that's handled very well, and I think the ending ends up being pitch perfect to how it should go, especially to hammer home the film's ultimate message, which is basically a larger encompassing of what it feels like to be a woman in society in general, which as a cisgender male, I'm never going to know for certain. And so anytime a movie can put me into shoes that I'll never be able to walk in, I sort of appreciate it, much like I love Spike Lee's Bamboozled, because I'll never not be a white guy, but that movie gives you a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be in a society that is racist towards you and has been for centuries and probably will be for more centuries. And so being able to get a piece of that empathy that is otherwise sort of blocked off by who you are, I really appreciate that. And I think Watcher did one of the best jobs at that. Because there are movies like Black Christmas 2019 that do a terrible job of that. And I don't even hate that movie. I hate it less than most people. But Watcher does it great, and it happens to just be a truly Hitchcockian movie. It feels like something Hitchcock or latter-day De Palma would have made, as far as how the suspense is handled and how you use quiet and score and long shots and far-off things. And so Chloe Okuna, I believe, is the director, and I think she's doing some of the new Fair Street movies. And I really hated the 3 Fair Street movies that Netflix had prior, so if she's behind it, she also did the Hail Ratima sequence from VHS 94, which is probably my favorite sequence from that particular VHS movie. She does a great job, and so this was her feature-length debut, and I'm very much looking forward to what she does, because she directs the fuck out of this movie. It is great. So, Watcher, number 2. And my number 1 best film of 2022 is David Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future. Now, I am a well-known David Cronenberg simp. And this was his triumphant return to body horror after he hadn't made one since Existenz in '99, I believe. So he'd been gone for a while. He'd been doing, I mean, he made some good stuff like Eastern Promises and some shitty stuff like Cosmopolis, but, you know, it's nice to have him back. So, why is Crimes of the Future the best film of the year? Well, Crimes of the Future is ultimately about progress versus regress. It's a movie about a future where certain people are starting to grow new vestigial organs, and the government's trying to track them and remove them. There's a lot of environmental devastation going on, and then there's also a little boy who has evolved to consume plastics, and there's sort of like followers who are trying to be like him, even though they haven't evolved that way, because it will be better for the Earth in general. And so a lot of the movie's main theme is about who will stand for progress of human society, and what are the conservative, both big and small c, and reactionary forces that are trying to inhibit that or stop the progress of history. And it is the most political movie with the most political messaging of the year in a way that I don't think most people are going to think this movie is political. I mean, I have to assume people aren't that dumb to not think so. But most of what I heard from the discourse around this movie is that it was mostly just about like the art scene. And it's kind of about that, but not in specificity. I actually think, I don't think Cronenberg meant this on a conscious level, or maybe he did. But a lot of the stuff that takes place in the art world, because the main character is this guy who is a performance artist, he grows a lot of vestigial organs, and he finds ways to like remove those organs for an audience as part of his art. And he goes to like another place where like there's a guy with a bunch of ears on his body, and he's a performance artist as well. But it's not really about like the art world or pretentious art types or anything like that. It's more, I mean, you could read that as a metaphor, which is what I don't think he may have meant. But a lot of that will work as a metaphor for the film industry. In fact, there's like a government bureau that is about like registering new organs that are created, and they're very much a corollary for censorship boards, like the censorship board in Canada or the NPA here in the US. But beyond that, the environmental stuff is much more on the surface of the movie. And obviously, we're not growing vestigial organs left and right. That's part of the body horror and part of the stuff that's in the movie fiction, whatever. But a lot of this movie is sort of about the people who are pushing forward and embracing the changes which are for the betterment of the human race, as the film tells us, versus the people who are scared of that, who are trying to control it, the government forces that are against it, the private corporations that have a vested interest in profit motive, in not really facilitating that progress, but sort of like kind of doing something with that. Or like fracking versus wind energy or something like that. Or EV cars, electricity does not come from magic, so it's not a solve-all to climate change. It just helps with emissions. So it's kind of about that. So you have like a company that makes stuff that helps people deal with this thing, with the vestigial organs that are growing and things like that. So they have a profit motive to continue to sort of like be a symptom but not a cure, or to remedy symptoms but not a cure to this condition. You have the government that is afraid and doesn't want it, and that is actively going against some of this stuff and going against the people who are embracing the change, which in this movie is the ability for human beings to consume plastic garbage. And I guess I should say that none of the trailers can prepare you for how funny the movie is. Like, the movie is sort of a sci-fi horror comedy, and the movie is much funnier than you think it's going to be. Kristen Stewart is great. She plays one of the people from like the government Oregon Registry Board, which is basically the movie stand-in for like a censorship board, but she's also like kind of curious about what she's censoring and everything, so she's kind of a stand-in for, you know, the people who get titillated off of the stuff that they keeping other people. It's like, it's okay for me to watch it as the censor, but you, the audience, you don't have the ability to, because you can't handle it, but I can, and I'm kind of titillated by it. And she is very funny in the movie, as is Viggo Mortensen and Leah Seydoux, I think her last name is. My apologies if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Scott Speedman is very good in it. He's not one of the funny ones. He plays his role mostly straight. But yeah, there's some great acting in it as well. And it definitely has, you know, the Cronenbergian stuff you want. There's new holes. There's new holes where holes don't belong. So you get that. But you'd have to see the movie to see how well its themes are ultimately conveyed. But as far as a movie that is just sort of about being progressive in the small and big P sense of the political term versus conservatives and reactionaries, like this is, in its own way, not so much a leftist movie. It doesn't have a lot of like Marxist themes or anything, but the most liberal movie. So it's not full left, but it's a little left. It is left if you consider Bernie Sanders left. It is not left if you consider Karl Marx left. So I'll put it that way. But as far as just a movie that is just against the reactionary forces of people trying to hinder progress out of fear or out of the profit motive or anything like that, it is one of the best encapsulations of that, because it's delivering that message. It's delivering that message clearly to an audience that is receptive of it, like myself. But it's a message that will probably go way over the heads of anybody who would disagree with that message, which is why I saw no conservative backlash to this movie. Most conservatives aren't going to watch a movie where someone tongues Viggo Mortensen's stomach pussy. So it's, they're already not going to watch this movie anyway. It's on Hulu right now. There's a 4K disc coming out next month that I've already pre-ordered from Diabolic DVD. So Crimes of the Future, my pick for the best film of 2022. That's my list. As always, all of these lists are subjective, so if you agree or disagree with any of my movies, or you disagree with the ranking or whatever, or there's movies that you love that didn't make my list, feel free to leave them in the comments below. There were a lot of movies I really liked this year. This was a really strong year, and if it didn't make my list, it's probably because I really, really liked it, but I didn't love it. Or I loved it, but not as much as the other 10 movies. Like, I love the Beavis and Butthead movie, I love The Fabelmans, and then there were movies I really liked, like The Whale, and Bones and All, and The Menu, and a lot of other movies that I really, really liked. Pretty much anything I give more than 3 stars to on Letterboxd, because 3.5 to me is a B+, and most movies are a B to me, because I just love movies. I'm not as picky and negative as some people think I am, just because I didn't like Black Panther Wakanda Forever or Jurassic World Dominion. But so there was really an abundance of riches. 2022, and thankfully, because the latter half of this year ended up being so terrible for me in my personal life, I was very, very happy that 2022 was a phenomenal year of movies. And while the movie industry might not be doing as well as we'd like, and a lot of movies that I really liked did not make money at the box office, including The Fabelmans and Bones and All, I mentioned some of those, or Glass Onion, which was a very good movie, but Netflix only put it in theaters for like a week. There's a lot of really good movies this year, and I would encourage you to check out a lot of that stuff. So if you go to my Letterboxd, I think you can search my different reviews by star rating. If you look at anything that's like a 3.5 star or above, that's a definite recommendation from me. 3 stars, it's good too. 2.5 is where it starts to get into it's okay but not good. 2.5 is like a C+ to me on my letter grading scale. But anything 3 and up is a good movie to me, at least enjoyment-wise, even if not quality-wise, because, I gave 5 stars to The Room. Terrible movie, one of the funniest comedies ever made. But you can find that stuff there. So, thank you for watching. I hope if there are some of these movies you haven't seen or you haven't heard of, that I've helped pad your watch list, and hopefully you can enjoy some of this stuff. And thank you for spending time with me and letting me deliver my opinion to you. Take care.